Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We'll be getting underway in a few minutes as the remaining folks enter the webinar. Ms. Lena, we're seeing your screen there. There we go. Thanks very much. All right, numbers of participants seems to be pretty steady. I'm going to give it maybe another 30 seconds or so, and we'll get underway. All right, well, I think we've got all of the truly enthusiastic people in. There's still maybe some more that will trickle in over the next 5-10 minutes, but we'll get things underway. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final week of National Engineering Month and today's session on proactive advocacy, how consulting engineers influence positive change. Please note that this session will be recorded. I'm Bruce Matthews, Executive Director at the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies Ontario, and we'd like to begin this session with a land acknowledgement. ACEC Ontario recognizes that its work, the work of its members, and the events of National Engineering Month 2022 take place on the traditional territories of a broad range of Indigenous peoples across the province. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this land. We also recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this province and our country as a whole. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territories now comprising Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories. We pay our respects to the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. ACEC Ontario is the industry association representing the interests of consulting engineering firms in the province. We promote and advance the business interests of our member firms and the value of the engineering work they do. Our goal is to have member firms prosper and be recognized for their influence and fundamental contributions to the social, environmental, and economic welfare of Ontario. Over 140 engineering firms in Ontario engage with ACEC Ontario because their success is enabled by our leadership in policy advocacy and risk management, and because we provide access to key knowledge sharing networks and relevant support services. Joining me for today's session is David Zurowell, our Director, Government and Stakeholder Relations. ACEC Ontario is a proud champion-level partner of National Engineering Month 2022, and David and I are delighted to be here today to discuss how consulting engineers approach government to create mutually beneficial solutions for our industry advocacy challenges. We've designed this session as a conversation, a fireside chat, as you may, touching on a number of key issues relevant to government relations and dealing with politicians and their staff. We're allowing ample time at the end for questions and answers and to engage with you in discussion, as it were. But if you have a burning question that's relevant to something we're saying at the moment, please feel free to enter it in the chat feature and we'll do our best to address it. To begin, we'll provide a little background about David and myself. I'm a professional engineer, licensed in Ontario since 1990. I'm a graduate of systems design engineering at Waterloo, and I began my engineering career working on aerospace and defense systems, designing control and display interfaces for complex operational environments. After about 13 years of practice, I then spent 10 years on the staff of Professional Engineers Ontario, the engineering regulator, dealing with complaint investigation, discipline prosecution, and enforcement matters. Prior to joining ACEC Ontario in 2018, I worked for other professional and occupational regulatory organizations, including the Real Estate Council of Ontario and the Ontario College of Trades, all of which had important government relations functions. David, perhaps you can give us an overview of your background and the career path that brought you to ACEC Ontario.
Sure, thanks very much, Bruce, and good morning, everybody. My name is David Zerwell, and I have spent about 20 years working in the public affairs space here in Ontario. I've been active in politics, in government, and in the business sector, working on everything from large P political efforts such as campaigns and elections, through to working as government staff, and then also working in the public affairs space for an international public relations firm. But over the last 15 years, I have worked in the broader design and construction sector for both contractors and design professionals. And the last 9 years, almost 9 years, I have been working with the consulting engineering industry here at ACEC Ontario, working on a number of issues important to the industry, particularly the creation of the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, the Construction Act, and the renewal of, or the creation of new asset management regulations for municipalities in Ontario. So have a broad experience in the broader sector. And we use that every day in our advocacy and work that we do for consulting engineers in Ontario.
Super, thanks, David. So let's get this underway. Proactive advocacy. Let's describe what we mean by that and consider the scope of advocacy interests that impact professional engineers. I like to take a first principles approach. Advocacy is rooted in the word advocate, which as a verb means to speak or write in favor of, or to plead, recommend, or support by argument a cause, a policy, etc. In our specific context, we're talking about advocacy to government to advance an interest, cause, or policy within government control that would impact our members. Proactive advocacy is about leading the charge and doing what's possible to actually control the agenda, as opposed to reacting to government announcements that impact the industry, the engineering industry. Proactive advocacy is about planting the seeds and influencing those announcements before they actually happen. Again, for some context for this session, consider the extent of government influence and control over the engineering sector. Engineering is a regulated profession under the purview of the Attorney General under the Professional Engineers Act. The projects on which engineers work are generally subject to a broad spectrum of government regulation: the Building Code, Environmental Protection Act, Occupation Health and Safety legislation, as well as other items of legislation that apply to those projects. Government policies that set priorities for government action, including spending on public infrastructure, that can determine exactly how much work is out there for professional engineers. And then last but not least, governments at all levels, federal, provincial, and municipal, are often the direct clients of engineering firms. So you've got government as regulator, government as policymaker, and government as client. There's a significant depth and breadth of opportunity for advocacy. So David, perhaps you can identify which, in our current Ontario government framework, which ministries have an impact on the work of professional engineers and how that impact manifests itself.
Sure, Bruce. That's a great segue into the work that we're doing, and I think that's one of the pluses that our industry has, is that it's the breadth and depth of what it is that we bring to the Ontario experience. We are involved in virtually, not to be too grandiose, but I think virtually everything that government does that impacts people's lives. The engineering community plays a very real role in making that a reality, and so that broad experience or that broad expanse focuses on a number of particular ministries. You've touched on some of them. The first and foremost is the Ministry of the Attorney General, and so that ministry has responsibility for and authority over 4 important professions and their respective acts here in Ontario, and that's namely lawyers, engineers, architects, and accountants. And all of these professions have the privilege of possessing self-regulating status. That's an important thing to recognize, that the engineering profession has that many others don't, is that self-regulating status and having that regulator in PEO. There is a responsibility that comes with that, that I think our industry certainly does hold dear, and that we do work to protect and to maintain in everything that we do. It's also important to know that the Ministry of the Attorney General also has responsibility for another piece of legislation, and that's the Construction Act. And that has recently come into, within the last 3 years, has come into being. After 35 years of work, we saw the old Construction Lien Act that originally was drafted in 1982, was updated in 2018, came into effect under with the Construction Act, and so that's another important piece of legislation that the Attorney General has authority over that impacts our sector. Another important ministry that we work with is the Ministry of Infrastructure. Ministry of Infrastructure is an interesting construct, in that when you look at what it's responsible for, yet the size and the scope of what it does, they're very different. So it's a ministry that can be best thought of as the quarterback for public infrastructure policy development and planning here in Ontario. And yet for a ministry that has that kind of responsibility, it does not have the thousands of people that some other line ministries have to actually make this a reality. So there's a lot of work that's done there, and it's really a lot of I guess you could really think of it as the nexus for the creation, development, implementation of what was the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. It's where that act lives and resides. And it was an important piece of legislation that was passed back in 2015 that has a direct impact not only on our industry, but it also took and had a direct impact on the engineering profession itself. That piece of legislation had a number of firsts. It prescribed the role of professional services providers, both engineers and architects and their associated industries, in the planning, procurement, and delivery of public infrastructure. It did that in a way that hadn't quite existed before. Something else that it did as well is this act created the province's first long-term infrastructure plan. By law, it's prescribed by law that the province shall have a 10-year plan that's refreshed every 5 years to maintain the investment and to focus on the priorities that Ontario needs to essentially maintain its prosperity, to ensure that we are going to have that economic development unfold in a logical and valuable way. And it's important because it's important for establishing, that positive impact of stable, predictable, long-term evidence-based infrastructure investment. And those things, those elements are really at the root of a lot of work that our profession does. As engineers, we have a fiduciary responsibility that flows out of the Professional Engineers Act to maintain the public welfare and to act in the interest of the public welfare. And so there are elements of that within essentially that Infrastructure Act. And so that's an important piece that influences a lot of work that we do. This ministry as well takes and also delegates authority to some very influential arm's length agencies responsible for the procurement and project delivery of infrastructure in Ontario. And that's Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx. And so Infrastructure Ontario is the procurement arm for a lot of infrastructure in Ontario. Metrolinx is more of a delivery type agency for transportation, for transit and transportation type projects. But they are both very important to a lot of the work that we do, and it impacts our profession. So that's the infrastructure, the Ministry of Infrastructure. Also important, we have a lot of engagement, and our industry does a lot of work with the Ministry of Transportation. It's one of the most prominent line ministries that make up the Ontario government, has an annual budget of more than $2 billion just for infrastructure. I think the overall budget for the ministry last year was just north of 6.3 billion. And the transportation and infrastructure development portion of that ministry is more than $2 billion. And that includes engineering and design and planning and studies and construction services or contract administration, all of these things which impact or impact our profession. And this includes work that on highways, roads, bridges, supporting projects, that intersect a lot of transit projects as well. So there is a lot of crossover between the Ministry of Transportation, MTO, and IO and Metrolinx. So that's another one. You had mentioned the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. There is a lot going on in that ministry as well. It's a very important ministry. It's continuing to grow in influence as we're seeing increasing environmental and development pressures globally, and particularly here in Ontario. And the work that's done by our profession and the related technical services that our industry focuses on, this is where a lot of technical expertise and innovation is provided. We spend a lot of time on environmental assessments, environmental certificates, this type of work on dealing with excess soils and the management of those soils, water, wastewater and stormwater projects, and the management of the taking of water and how it is managed is very important. And so we're seeing that as we become more sensitive or increasingly sensitive to environmental conditions in Ontario, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is going to continue to play a larger role as well. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, another very important ministry that you had mentioned as well, Bruce, the issues around the Ontario Building Code, that's very important. Land use planning, the Planning Act, those types of efforts. A lot of building sciences and services type work is done out of this ministry as well. Bruce?
Okay. So
yeah, no,
that's,
you look
yeah.
like do you want me to keep going? Because we got one more. I mean,
No, please. Yep. Finish off, please. Yep. I may have looked like I froze, but I'm good.
Okay. No, it looked like you were going to add to what I was saying. So
no, go right
thanks
ahead.
very much. And so that Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, it's important to note, that ministry works in concert with a lot of others. I mean, it works in concert with Environment and Conservation and Parks. It works also particularly with the Infrastructure Ministry. A piece of work that we have done a number of years ago now, was 2015, 2016. We spent a lot of time working with those ministries in their joint effort to renew the regulations or create new regulations around asset management planning in Ontario. Very, very important work that was done, because it's those new regulations and it's the requirements for those asset management plans that have to come into effect after this summer. Municipalities have to make do the planning and make budgetary decisions and budgetary allowances or allocations to create a specific plan that then will feed into the government, that can then inform the decision making that's going to be done through the Infrastructure Act. And that's where we're providing a lot of value as a profession, is in working with municipalities to develop those asset management plans, to then take and help decide where those investments are going to be made, and ultimately help grow and assure the prosperity of Ontario as we move forward. So there's a lot of important work being done there as well. And I think just lastly, I think, we touched on a lot of things, but not typically, but recently we've been working with the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development. There are new government initiatives to recognize and facilitate the integration of internationally trained professionals and workers into the post-pandemic Ontario economy, and this is part of the government's economic recovery initiatives, and that's led to a new scope or a new avenue of engagement with our industry. The Working for Workers Act has led to the development of regulations under FARPACTA, which have seen our industry work with ministry officials there where typically we haven't. At the heart of this engagement is really about work to resolve market capacity issues. That's something, Bruce, that you've been working on very closely. The ministry typically focuses its attention to trade apprenticeships, and if current initiatives can help develop market capacity discussions to address the issue for professional services, then that's all the better. We need to sort of get that ministry past just apprenticeships and registrations and training. We really need to take a look at how can we take and deal with market capacity issues that impact the engineering profession as well. So thank you for the time and the indulgence to explain all of that. But those are the key ministries where we spend a lot of time and effort working on behalf of our industry.
Yep, super, David. Appreciate that overview. And I'd like to assure the people who are tuned in that can sound overwhelming. There's a lot of moving parts that clearly impact the professional engineering sector. However, it's a matter of recognizing how important that understanding is of what that structure is all about. And just touching on that last point with respect to the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, the fact is professional engineers don't work in a vacuum. If you look at the member firms of ACEC Ontario, we employ a broad spectrum of individuals, not just professional engineers. There's technicians and technologists, there's geotechnical people, there are architects not working for a number of our firms. There are, sort of a whole host of talents that have to come together to ultimately get infrastructure and these projects built. And indeed, the issue of the supply of individuals and the capacity within the trades to actually be able to deliver these projects is a concern to the engineering sector. It's all great for us to do the design work and put things on paper, so to speak, or on digits in a computer. But if it can't actually get built because there's no capacity, then it doesn't do us any good. So just as an aside, ACEC Ontario is a member organization of the Construction and Design Alliance of Ontario, which has a very large advocacy activity of its own, sort of representing both the design and construction sectors from a certain way. So that's appreciating in that overview. But again, it comes down to sort of why is this important? Why is it understanding this framework and those impacts? Why it's essential if you want to be successful in relation to your advocacy efforts. And I'm going to position this in fairly straightforward terms. Not everyone may agree, but I'll throw this out there. I like to think of it in terms of government decisions are political decisions. We often sometimes think of government as one thing and the political parties as another, but the fact is any meaningful decision that's made by a government of the day would probably be made differently to some extent, large or small, if there was a different political party in power. Certainly, the role of an opposition in a government is to critique the way that government is doing it, and probably suggest that we would do it differently. So it's important to understand that framework, but when it comes to advocacy issues, it is important to recognize that connection between, yes, they are decisions of government, they are decisions of ministries, but they are colored strongly by political decisions. So with that, let's talk a little bit about interacting with the government of the day. And I'm going to sort of position it like this. And David, this is obviously trite for you, but again, for the benefit of those watching, it's that difference between what matters to them and what matters to us, what matters to the people who are doing the advocating versus what matters to government of the day. So David, maybe you can speak to that. What is the decision-making process within government? Your background has touched on it to a great deal. So what's that decision-making process? And then how do you find, as a organization looking to advocate, how do you find that intersection between their interests and those of the industry that you're advocating for?
Right. I mean, yeah, let's unpack that, Bruce, because that's something that there are a lot of moving parts to it, and it's something that, gosh, it's not as straightforward as it may seem. And you're correct. I mean, you're right. I mean, looking at government decisions are all political decisions, because the issue at play really with every government is that there are competing agendas, and there is the competing agenda of what government wants versus what stakeholders see as what government needs. And so from the moment after the election is signed, sealed, and delivered, this is the push and the pull that takes place between the governments and stakeholders. And success really depends. Success for organizations, and let's talk about this in the context of ACEC Ontario and the consulting engineering industry in Ontario. Success depends on what you said, finding those intersections between those competing interests. And the issue with this is that these interests often change, and they're subject to shifting priorities, and they're subject to timing as well. And so, while governments have an agenda and stakeholders have an agenda, you get wonderful facts of life that come along, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, or the war in Ukraine, that had two very different things that have had very direct impacts on the experience that is Ontario, and that takes away from the attention that government has on its agenda. And so, like I said, the success really depends on finding those intersections as to what it is that you can use to get government's attention, hold its attention, and then demonstrate that you're able to take and well, you're able to influence them because you have something that helps them achieve that agenda. I think that these factors all combine to influence how decisions get made, and so it's important to understand or have an understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve, how that fits into the government of the day's overall plan, and the process of government decision making. I mean, that's a multifaceted and multi-layered process that you then have to take your objective and have layer that on top of what you're trying to achieve. And then you have to then consider that even decisions that positively impact what you're trying to achieve take time. So you may have what government needs, but then there's actually going through the process of government, from that political decision that's made, then there's now a bureaucratic process that has to be followed for those actions to be taken, and where you actually get an idea that can be developed into a policy that is then developed into perhaps legislation or regulation that has to be passed into law and then implemented. So there's a fair bit at play there.
So actually, let's just look at that a little bit more. And I agree, and we've certainly experienced this over the past 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of that decision making, and I think the statement you made in terms of the political decision followed by bureaucracy is brilliant. I think that's really what people have to be attuned to. Nothing here happens super fast. But for example, we're dealing with the Ministry of Transportation, and in circumstances where even the minister, may make a pronouncement about either at a policy level or something impacting a piece of legislation, can you explain the fact that, from that announcement to the point where the actual sort of tangible action is taken, the kind of steps that have to go through, and the fact that the announcement is made doesn't necessarily mean, things are going to go forward, because there are competing interests even within government. Can you just maybe expand on that?
Absolutely. I mean, if you could even take and you can even take and look at something like the announcement of a new project. Let's say you're making the announcement of, you're announcing funding for a project. You've got, government has an agenda, and that agenda is directed by the Premier's office at the most fundamental level. The Premier's office takes and once cabinet is formed, Premier's office takes and develops mandate letters for ministers, and each of those mandate letters as a whole really constitutes something like a strategic plan that the government has. And then those ministers, as members of cabinet, have delegated authority to essentially follow that mandate letter implement that mandate letter to achieve the results that the Premier is expecting it be done. And so part of those, that mandate is taking and making decisions on projects and announcements and funding. And so you then have to, it's the responsibility of the minister and their ministry to decide how they're going to take and which projects do they want to achieve. They have to rank and prioritize those. They then have to take and put proposals together explaining how that's going to happen. That then is forwarded to the policy committee in cabinet, which then sort of greenlights it, which then puts it over to Treasury Board, who then says, okay, we'll give you the money to do this. And then, once that's greenlit, then you have to take and actually wash it through the government's calendar of when do we want to implement this, because they have to look at how big of a priority is it, what other priorities is it competing against, and then you can actually make your announcement with a timeline. And then once that timeline is made, once that announcement is made, then government has to take and lay it out on its calendar and then start implementing that project that gets announced over the number of years in order to do this. And when we're talking about something that has, a large capital asset construction, let's say it can be whatever you like. It can be a new piece of highway or a bridge or something like that. That then starts the clock ticking on the procurement process for, the planning on, what is it that we're looking to build? So it almost, you take it down to that very basic level. What's the intent of the asset? What is it that it's going, what purpose is it going to serve? You have to take and, if we're looking at something like a transport, a new highway, there has to be an environmental assessment done, and then lots of environmental planning around that. I mean, all of these things take years. So while you're making this decision to spend the money, the actual, from the time that decision is made until the actual, I'm really sorry to say this, Bruce, the shovel hits the ground. Yeah, I know.
We hate that phrase.
We are not fans of that phrase, shovels in the ground, yipes. But until it can take a number of years. A speedy environmental assessment, full environmental assessment's 5 years. So this is a very rough sketch of the process that's involved in, for us to begin to do the work that we do. And that's why it's so important for sectors to think about what it is that they're going to contribute to this overall plan so that they can do the work, especially for us. I mean, as the engineering profession, let's just talk consulting engineering, because it takes in that whole scope of, planning. And we're looking at planning, environmental considerations, design, architecture, construction services together. It's the early works. I mean, this is what we're contributing. This is the value that we bring, is those early works, so that we can set these projects up for success. And it's by understanding and appreciating the value and the impact of those early works. It's getting in there early. That's where we can take and really make a difference for Ontario. And it's only by understanding that and continually working with governments who perhaps have a different perception of what success is, or they're defining success differently. They very much like to do ribbon cuttings and getting in front of a camera and making that announcement and moving forward with accelerated builds and all sorts of things. All good stuff. But it has to be taken in the proper context of early works and the value that can be provided there, so we can move forward smartly.
It's an interesting thing, knowing our disdain for the shovels in the ground and the photo ops, notwithstanding there was one was it yesterday with respect to the Ontario line and so on. We almost need an equivalent where the politicians go to the offices of a consulting engineering firm and watch them open the file on their CAD system or whatever it is to start the design. Like, there it is, it's underway, right? You want that sort of same level of milestone of importance to recognize that this now is happening, this design effort. It all happens, generally speaking, in an office and the like, but it is no less important, of course, than the physical construct that takes place out there in the real world. But as this audience knows, and I don't really need to remind them, that so much of what professional engineers do is kind of invisible to the real world, and including being invisible to politicians. And, part of the challenge we have, both ACEC Ontario, advocating on behalf of engineering firms, OSPI advocating on behalf of individual engineers and sort of the profession as a whole that way. Part of the challenge is, from the public's perspective, professional engineering is actually pretty well regulated. Things aren't perfect, no question there, but there are really very few public level issues that come to the fore, that become fodder in the press, that give the government a black eye, things that ultimately can cost votes, right? Because as I said earlier, with respect to government decisions being political decisions, one aspect of politics is this desire to remain elected and remain the government of the day come election time, and therefore high on the priority list, and I'm assuming you're going to agree, high on the priority list are the kind of things that are divisive from a vote perspective. And part of the challenge is there's just not much going on in the world of professional engineering at its foundational level in terms of how we're regulated. I know we have concerns about things that are in the Professional Engineers Act. OSPI does as well. And we've both had conversations as organizations with the Attorney General, et cetera. But getting that needle to move has been, almost impossible, simply because in the list of grand priorities and things that are truly impacting them politically, it's not on the radar. So, I'm going to use that as a bit of a segue to perhaps talk about, what is it? Maybe you can just give folks an overview here of ACEC's Ontario's approach to government relations and to advocacy, and what are the sort of the key elements that we have in place that, notwithstanding what I said in terms of the difficulty in getting traction, that has allowed us to have some success over the years.
Sure, and I think you've made some really good points in your segue there, and I'd like to touch on just a couple of things that I would like to unpack as we go through this conversation. I think it's very important for us to realize a couple of things. Because there isn't that chaos or that concern, or that it's very easy to overlook the work that that our profession does, that our sector does, because we make it happen, we get it done. It's not. Some people don't see it as the most exciting, but it's really, we are the cogs between theory and practice on a number of different levels, and it's very important. I think it's very important now, more so than ever, because if you take a look at how governments have been dealing with infrastructure, certainly over the last 15 years, it's not so much about the design, it's not so much about the execution, it's about procurement. Governments are all about procurement, governments are all about risk transfer, governments are all about delivery. And that's a consequence of design build, or AFP, or P3s, or all of these things. That is when it became apparent that the level of infrastructure investment that was going to be required in Ontario to take and get us what it is that we need in order to be prosperous and to develop in the way that we are aspiring to. It just really, it changed the whole dynamic. So, where the design is important, because that's where the innovation comes from. That's where the art of the profession really shines through, and those are very important things. But with this shift to the procurement focus in public infrastructure, there's a requirement for the profession to really knuckle down and think about the business of the business. This is where the effectiveness as a sector, as an industry, shines through. It's how are you able to compete as a business in those procurements against other elements within our industry? How are you able to be competitive in when you're dealing with other owners, when you're dealing with general contractors, when you're dealing with subcontractors? I think that the engineering profession had a luxury of being able to really be immersed in the design and letting the design sell the capability. And I think that is, with the emergence of this procurement mindset, It's very much more the business of the business that I think we need to focus on. And so I don't mean to digress too far on that, but I mean, I think this is really, it's the need to embrace this shift that is what is going to keep us relevant as a sector and is going to keep us competitive, because there's a lot of pressure on the commoditization of the service. There's a lot of pressure on fees. There's a lot of pressure on insurance and insurability of projects. And I think it's that approach that's going to help us be successful. So we're talking about our approach that we use in advocacy and in government relations. And you're right. I mean, you talked about, this is a process. It's not a one-off task. It's one of those things that proper advocacy, not to be overly cliche about it, but it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We talked about how you get governments that are elected, they're here for a good time, not a long time. They've got a 4-year window, and then they have agendas, and those agendas change given different pressures of the day. But so looking at, excuse me one second. So in that context, we want you have, in order to be successful, you have to know what it is that you want to achieve. You have to know what your objectives are, how they fit into the government's agenda and its objectives. And if it doesn't, what you're trying to achieve doesn't, what do you need to do to try and integrate it into the government's agenda? And we have done that. We have been successful at doing that in the past, and we'll have to do it again in the future. You really have to understand how you stack up against other stakeholders as well, with their objectives, some of which, and here is the thing, other stakeholders are going to be working against you. Some are going to be trying to achieve things that you could potentially ally with them and work with them. This is one of the beautiful things about the Construction Design Alliance of Ontario. It brings together the broader perspective of the entire construction and design sector in Ontario. And then you've got other stakeholders that they're engaged in what they're trying to achieve that has absolutely nothing to do with what you're trying to do, but they're eating up the time and the resources and the attention span, the bandwidth of government, and using up that time to make it, and make things more difficult, because it's all about time. It's all about a matter of time. And so you have to know where you fit and how you're going to make yourself useful. And I think that, that leads to something else. I mean, the other, another key tenet to how we approach things as a sector, as an industry, as an association, and representing our member companies, is that we very much have a help us help you approach to our advocacy. The most effective method to doing this is to position yourself, position your objectives as a means to an end to government. It's sort of that, get in there, make yourself useful. And you want to do this in a way that's going to be mutually beneficial. And that's one of the things that the consulting engineering profession industry, the consulting engineering industry in Ontario is very lucky in that everything we've been talking about so far when it comes to planning and design and construction services, all of these things, they all have a positive bearing and they all have a positive impact on the processes that government is using to achieve its objectives. So we can bring value, but it's really about creating that understanding in what governments are trying to achieve versus how they're trying to achieve them. This is the friction point that we often have, and this is where we spend a lot of our time and effort. It's about educating particularly elected officials about how how they may be trying to achieve a certain objective, how they're going about doing it is counterproductive to what's actually required in order to getting it done. And that's important, because just as an anecdote, I mean, or just as an aside, when the Ford government, this current administration, was elected in the June of 2018, between the forming of government in 2018 and the Labor Day weekend of that summer, the Premier's office had booked appointments for across government. So it wasn't just for Premier's office, but it was for all government. It had booked appointments with 3,500 unique stakeholders. So this is the span of, this is the size of the universe that we're working in. We know that there's 3,299 other or 3,499 other stakeholders out there that are trying to get government's attention. And so by being prepared, by understanding what you want, by having a perception of how what you want can fit into the government's agenda, and being useful, you're able to take and essentially work together in an ideal situation. You're able to work together to achieve a solution that's going to service everybody, that's going to work for everybody. And this is an important thing that will happen. If you can achieve that, an important thing will happen. The relationship that will take place between your government contact in a particular file, we're talking MTO, let's say, you then have that relationship converts or changes from a stakeholder relationship to a partnership. It evolves, it transforms. Once you realize there's that mutual benefit to working together and that you can provide a solution for each other, you convert that stakeholder, that transactional relationship, to a partnership. That is the aha moment that every stakeholder group tries to achieve. And not everybody is able to do it. It doesn't always happen very often. And once it happens, you're not guaranteed that you're going to maintain that partnership. That partnership or that relationship has to be, fed and watered, if you will, and maintained. It's going to ebb and flow. And so it's a you can see that this is what we mean by marathon and not a sprint, because what I'm talking about is what we're talking about here right now. We're talking about just one particular interaction with one particular ministry on one particular file. We're working at 5 or 6 ministries with probably 5 or 6 issues for each of them. And so it all adds up. And so the help us help you element is a very, very important component.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, that is certainly going to be one of the takeaways from today is, successful advocacy really requires that attitude of help us help you. If you go in thinking, here's what we want the government to do because it'll be good for our members, and with almost I don't care whether it benefits the government or not, but our members need this and they want us to argue for this or whatever, I think frankly you're dead in the water. It's just really not going to get any traction unless you're able to demonstrate how, and this is where I talk about connecting the dots. There may or may not be a direct obvious correlation between the ask that you have as an association and the interest and agenda of the government. But there may be ways to connect the dots saying, if this happens, then this, and then poof, now part of your agenda is fulfilled. Just going back a little bit, still within this package of our approach, and
yep.
Like you've talked about relationships, which is truly key, but maybe provide some insight as to how things are structured within a ministry. Our relationship, generally speaking, isn't with the minister directly. Yes, we'll get some FaceTime on occasion, but that's not where I'm going to put words in your mouth, but I don't think that's where the meat of the relationships and the meat of the way advocacy happens is. Can you give folks a sense of how staffing is structured within a minister's office, and what are the roles there that as an organization doing advocacy, who is it you want to target? Yeah, you do want to get a little bit of face time for the minister, but really the meat, the good accomplishment, the ability to actually get on the agenda, the people who themselves will influence the minister, who are those folks, and what kind of roles do they have?
Sure, that's a really good point to make, Bruce. And I would say that the person you want to spend the absolute least amount of time in front of is the minister of anything. And I don't say that and that ministers are not important. They are very, very important. But the minister is the CEO of that portfolio, and the minister has has a lot on their plate. They have a lot that they are responsible for to deliver, and so a good, effective piece of advocacy work is really going to, you finish off that work. You're crossing the finish line when you're coming in to sit down and have the meeting with the minister to greenlight your initiative and carry it forward into action. And so it's very rare that you have interaction with a minister other than that. So what is important? So how do things work within a minister? Now, ministers' offices are all a little bit different, but they do follow a somewhat similar structure. The chief operating officer, or the 2IC in any ministry, and a minister's office is the chief of staff, and so the chief is usually supported by a number of directors. So you've got a director of policy, you've got a director of communications, and you've got a director of stakeholder affairs. And roughly speaking, the size of the minister of the portfolio obviously has greater or smaller staff that determines that. But those three directors are primarily the folks that are making the decisions on a day-to-day basis. And those folks, like the directors of policy and the directors of stakeholder affairs, are supported by senior advisors or advisors that carry individual files, and they do the actual work. They are the issues experts that you want to be engaging with on particular files for the most part. Unless it's a very, very important file or a very central file, directors in a minister's office do not usually carry one particular file unless it is absolutely essential for the government. So those are the people that you want to be, you're engaging with. It's usually the policy advisor or senior policy advisor on a particular file, and it's the policy people that you're working on the nuts and bolts elements of a file. It's the stakeholder affairs people that are usually your first point of contact, because you want them to be aware of who you are. And quite frankly, it's the stakeholder affairs person in any minister's office who is the political person. They're sort of the commissar of the minister's office, who really determines, okay, is this person a friend or a foe? Is this person bringing value to the table? And is this somebody we can work with? Because you may have what they need, but if they can't work with you, in some groups, you find yourselves in that kind of a situation, it makes it difficult. The director of communications, they're the person that they work with the policy folks, they work with the stakeholder folks on the messaging. If you're working with somebody who's an advisor to policy or stakeholder affairs advisor, and then your efforts start looping in your communications people, then you start looking at messaging. That's where you're starting to make some progress on your issue. And when issues develop to a certain level, sometimes whether it's negative or positive, sometimes you will interact as well with the chief of staff, but usually only if there is something that is fairly well advanced. All of this is really important. All of this is one side of the equation. Ministers' offices are very important. On the other side of those offices are the ministry staff. So the minister has a counterpart in the deputy minister. Those deputies have senior staff as well, and assistant deputy ministers who run particular divisions within a ministry, who then have directors and those directors run branches. And then, it's really at the director and manager level in those branches where the decisions are being made on initiatives that you're trying to achieve. And a good policy or a good issue that you're trying to advocate for is necessarily going to take and work on both sides of those coins. You're going to be working with minister staff and with ministry staff, because it's the ministry officials that have the institutional memory on whether something has been done before. Your unique idea is probably not as unique as you may think it is. But also they're providing the advice to the political staff, who typically are coming and going every 4 years or less. They're the ones that provide the advice as to, well, minister, you may want to give this further thought, or yes, minister, you should consider moving forward with this. They play an integral role in all advocacy efforts.
Super, appreciate that. We are about an hour into our hour-and-a-half session. We're going to take a moment here. Let's sort of come up for air, take your sip of your coffee, and take a breath. I'm not wrapping things up officially, but I do want to open up the floor a bit here and see if there's any questions, comments from folks in the audience before, we've got some other issues we can certainly delve into if there's no specific questions. But I think what you've tied into at the end there is that important aspect of relationships, that advocacy is relationship building within the ministries, and that it's that connection. I hope people can sort of now infer, if you develop those relationships on a help us help you basis, then you do transfer from being just amongst a pile of stakeholders into that trusted partner side of things. And what I like to think of in terms of how do you know when you're being successful with respect to your advocacy efforts isn't necessarily measured by outcomes, that you got a certain change to a piece of legislation made. Yes, that's nice in its context, but that you've built and maintained that relationship to the point when the ministry comes to you before you come to them on an issue. When they know they've got something burbling up inside, they know who they need to talk to from an industry side, and they start coming to your door with something brand new and that they want to let you know about early, rather than waiting until much later in that political process that you described. That to me is a true measure of success. And fortunately, we have had that certainly with our contacts at Infrastructure Ontario and within the MTO. We've got folks who are, letting us know about what's going on. So we have been quite successful. So I'm going to take a quick pause just at that point. Anybody have any questions, issues, thoughts based on what we've been talking about thus far? And you want to just type those into the chat feature, and happy to handle that. Not seeing anything come up just at the moment, so consider that invitation open. Certainly for the balance of the next half hour, we'll certainly get wrapped up by 11:30. But now I'm going to throw a different wrinkle into it as part of our discussions. David, you talked about the staffing that's there and the ministers and so on, but as any good engineer knows, through the second law of thermodynamics, nothing stays. Cabinet shuffles happen, right? So, as an organization with your advocacy plan going in place, and you're going gangbusters on moving an issue, and you actually think you're moving the needle, and all of a sudden there's a cabinet change. The minister is no longer the same minister. It's possible, I gather, that that minister may take some of their senior staff with them in terms of those positions that you spoke to, a chief of staff, a stakeholder, or a policy person may go with the minister onto their new posting. So any thoughts or approaches about how do you deal with that as an advocacy or an organization interested in advocacy when a cabinet shuffle changes? Is it a full reset? Are there things you can do to try and recover?
Right, and Bruce, some people who know me may sort of see this as a typical answer, and I don't mean to be glib. It depends, and I just would like to touch on something you mentioned before. You talk about what does success look like. probably the favorite the favorite word used in government is no. Because there is a constant need, there is a constant desire for decisions to be made, for things to happen. And you're right, when you have reached the point where you have government folks, you have ministry people, you have minister staff coming to you and saying, we would really like for you to work with us on this because it's important. That is, that you have met with a good degree of success and that you can be counted on to provide input. Something else that's important to know as well, and this fits into the issue around the cabinet shuffle piece, is that another element of success, because you're going to be told no 90% of the time. No does not mean never. No usually means not right now. If you're able to take and develop a good relationship with the people you're working with, and developing those relationships, it really is, good advocacy is like good finance. You want to save more than you spend. So your advocacy work, you're oftentimes taking and working on things. You're providing people with information, support, and solutions to which they don't necessarily fit your objective, but you're helping government continue to do its work. You're building equity. So how do you know when you're being successful, when you're not getting that regulation passed, you're not getting that piece of legislation bill done the way you want it? If you're getting your phone calls and your emails returned really quickly, like I'm talking within 24 hours, or you've got somebody's access to somebody's mobile number, those are really good indications that you're somebody that they are willing to talk to, and you've been essentially been given the access. So you're still probably going to hear no, or you're going to at least have a discussion around why you're getting to no. You're making progress. So it's about that equity. That equity, although you may change ministers, doesn't necessarily leave the ministry. That's why you want to have good connections with the ministry staff as well. When you're dealing with an issue that is particularly politically sensitive, if the minister changes, you've got a new relationship to build, and you've got new staff to work with. Senior staff will usually travel with a minister unless you've got very hands-on political staff that are there to drive a government agenda, and they stay within a certain portfolio. You're usually looking at some form of reset when you're dealing with a shuffle. If a government has been around for a while and they're not shuffling too often, and you're able to establish relationships, particularly with the portfolios that our industry deals with, these are portfolios that require a certain level of skill and expertise. So you may actually have the person who was maybe the infrastructure minister becomes the transportation minister, or vice versa, or the minister of municipal affairs becomes the new attorney general. So you can actually transport or transplant those relationships, and what you're working on then is the context of that relationship. And so by being consistent, by paying into that savings account and building up that equity and being that useful resource as a stakeholder, it pays off over the long term. Again, this is a marathon. You want to be that known quantity as that resource that is good to have, and so that you can help be that helpful partner to government, because eventually you're going to want to draw down on that equity. We've done it on a couple of things. With the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, we drew down hard on that act, because when that legislation was first tabled, engineers were not even written into the act. There was prescribed roles, and there was going to be prescribed work to be done by contractors and by architects. The engineers were nowhere to be found in that act. and we had to roll up our sleeves and go to work on that legislation, and we were included. So, but it cost us, but that's what you have that equity for, and it all worked out in the end.
Excellent example. Excellent example. All right, still not seeing anything in the chat, so clearly, and no one's running away, it seems, so people are still engaged with us. I got two more things I think I'd like. Oh, David, you want to just finish
really
up
quickly, Bruce?
Sure.
I was just looking in the chat here, and so Wilma Schroeder's has a question around how do you reach the right person within the bureaucracy who can actually listen and affect change? And Wilma, that's a really good question. And your follow-on or supplementary question to that is, how do these people influence procurement staff? These folks typically are the procurement staff, and so it's difficult. It takes time, and you have to establish working relationships with these people, and figuring out who is whom. Is difficult. If you're starting, if you're new to this, it's about trial and error, and it's about maybe working with other people in the industry who you may know, who perhaps reach in and maybe have some relationships. It's tapping into those questions, those people to say, who should I really speak to about this? I think it's important to point out that when we're dealing with ministry staff decision makers, it all boils down to that you may have a good working relationship, you may respect each other, you may have what appears to be a very reasonable proposal or a demand, an objective that you're trying to achieve. If it's not written in, if what you're trying to achieve is not written into the mandate, it's very, that person whom and work with very well will still tell you no. And it's very difficult to unravel those situations. And sometimes it's, sometimes you have to go right to the very top, and, engaging what you call the center, or even dealing with Premier's office to plead your case in that respect. You have to do that carefully, and you have to follow a very specific path in order to get there, because you certainly don't want people feeling as if though you've gone around them to get what you want. To Bruce's earlier point, that's a zero-sum game. You're going to burn a lot of equity very quickly doing that. So, yeah, tough.
Just as a resource for folks who are, for lack of a better word, starting out, there is actually an online directory with respect to Government of Ontario staffing, infogo.gov.on.ca. You can type in a ministry name, you can do a search by, if you put the minister's name, and then ultimately see all of the structure below the minister and the few people that report to him or her. So again, it's infogo, info go.gov.on.ca. It's a really good getting a sense of it. And my experience has been that seems to get kept up to date reasonably well. So it is a good resource. So like I said, I think just as we got another 15 minutes here, two things I'd like to touch on. And one of them was going to come out of the blue, but I'll start with perhaps the second one. As much as we've talked about governments of the day, we're talking about, frankly, the folks who are in power. We're talking about ministers and the like. Of course, a parliament is made up of two sides and sometimes a little bit more. So can you talk about relationships with the opposition in the context of trying to do advocacy? And I think the point that'll be of interest for folks is, are there any risks associated with attempting to engage with the opposition to try and get their voice added to yours as you're dealing with government? Is there any risk? Is it seen as fair play? Are there concerns that you are no longer seen as friends of the government if all of a sudden you're rallying the opposition? So any thoughts on that?
Right, very good question, Bruce. And gosh, so is there a risk to engaging the opposition? I think it's in all things. It's what is it? How is it that you want to engage with them? What are you trying to achieve? I think we have a very unique situation with the current provincial parliament in that we've got one opposition party, the traditional. I guess you're looking at a very traditional core party, does not have party standing in the Ontario Liberal Party. And we're also working through a pandemic where there really is, what is it that you're opposing at the moment, and is it worth it to engage on those types of issues? This has been a very difficult number of. I think the last 4 years have been a challenge because we're dealing with an unfamiliar and a non-traditional government structure and style. The pandemic, for certainly the last 2 years, has really taken that regular discourse, the things that you would usually, where you would really engage with an opposition if things don't work out with a government, that cut and thrust in question period, those sorts of things. There just hasn't been the opportunity to engage in that fashion. So I think that an opposition party engagement, it's useful if there are synergies or commonalities that exist with your agenda, and so that it's I think the last 4 years has been difficult for business in looking at the shadow cabinet that is Andrea Horwath. The Ontario NDP party has typically not readily engaged on core business issues. That has not been their priority. The issues that they do have as a priority are certainly broadly very important, but certainly a challenge for our specific industry to engage with them. I know from our past experience, even preceding the current administration, with the Wynne governments and even the McGuinty governments before then, having a constructive dialogue with the Ontario NDP has been a challenge, but we did have dialogue with shadow cabinet members who was then the Ontario Progressive Conservatives. So it does happen. You should do it. You should have it. No government lasts forever, and quite frankly, it's just good practice. You do want to be respectful of the opposition. And it's always good to engage them and let you know what's important to you, because you never know who the next government is going to be. So I think you have to look at who you're working with and what you have to work with and what your objectives are, Bruce.
Super. And that's actually a really good segue, thank you, into the other point I am going to make is, again, as an organization wishing to advocate, and I'm not sure if you want to call this strategy versus tactics, but can you comment on the issue of timing within the overall 4-year mandate? So are there either issues or approaches that you would use in that first year of a mandate that may or may not be appropriate, or things that are better in that second or third year? And then honestly, is there really much hope in terms of advocacy during sort of the 4th year of a mandate when everyone seems to be focused on re-election? So can you just sort of comment on how the flavor of advocacy might change over that 4-year stretch?
Sure, absolutely. I think, and this gets back to the beginning of our discussion when we were talking about figure out who you are, what you're about, and what you want. You need to have that understood and figured out and ready to go when the new legislative session for the new government kicks off after an election. So we're going to have E-Day on June 2nd. There's going to need to be a certification of government and then creation of a cabinet, that sort of thing. So, but what's going to happen is the new government, the new legislative session is going to start in the fall, in September, most likely. You really want to take and have your key 1, 2, or 3 issues lined up and ready to go for that time, because you want to, and just like everybody else who's worth their salt, they're going to have their agendas teed up to try and integrate those quickly into the government's new agenda. they're going to develop a throne speech, and they're going to take and, chart out a course of where they want to go over their mandate, those 4 years. You want to try and, excuse me, you want to try and fit into any gaps that exist early on, because you're not going to want to take and be introducing something that's going to require, we're not going to want to open up the Construction Act, or we're not going to want to open up the Professional Engineers Act year 3 of a government mandate. Just not going to happen. So you want to really take a look at legislative change, regulatory change, certainly within the first 18 months or so. But that doesn't mean that the regular business of the business, the business of the business is not going to continue throughout the entire 4 years. The business of government carries on even during election campaigns. I know that, we have work that we're doing with ministries, Ministry of Transportation, and particularly Infrastructure Ontario. We're reviewing standard forms of agreement with those bodies right now. And, we're going to have an election in about 61 days. During that time period when there are, the members are out on the hustings, that work on those contracts is going to continue. So that's how things change during those mandates. And you have to pivot to the time you have available.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And you're right. There's the backgrounding stuff that's all part of that, building the runway and using the runway where you're multiple years that you may just recognize this is going to have to wait till the next mandate of a government before we get the real action, but you still lay the foundation work and so on. Because as you say, certainly in that last year, I spoke earlier about the fact that, what matters to government, very much solidifies into what's going to affect the voter, and what can I do and come out with and take action on that's going to improve the chances of re-election. And if it doesn't work in that lens, then you're just going to get put to the side until that next government. I think that's certainly a fair perspective.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we've got 10 or 9 minutes left according to this. One last issue I will throw it as well then, since we're talking about elections and governments and so on. How do things change in a minority government situation? Clearly we've got that situation in federally right now. Depending on who one talks to, there's a certain likelihood that we may have the same thing in Ontario. Does the nature of advocacy change when you're dealing in a minority?
That also is another really good question. And so it's going to, it depends. So, and I say that a little bit for effect, but not really. I think, Bruce, this is where it's really important to take and have your sense of, this is where your sense of self and where your issues, the understanding of your issues, and the evidence that you're using to back up the rationale for your issues is so important, because that won't change. What will change is the engagement. How does the engagement work? So what do we know? We know that, given the discussion that's been going on since the new year, leading up into the current contest that's going to kick off in just over a month, the current opposition parties have said they would not support the current government should they need to form a minority. So what does that mean? That means necessarily that you would be looking at a minority government, or even a coalition style of government, that it's not just like you've got a holdover from the previous administration with something else bolted onto it. You've got an entirely new construct. So what will be important then is you have to understand what went into the deal to create the coalition. And that's what then has to be layered on top of your objectives. Is what you're asking for not just going to appeal to, or is it going to service the needs of the government? Is it going to service both needs of the two parties that are keeping this government together? So it requires a lot more nuance. It requires a lot more attention, because it won't be so cut and dry. Just like these two parties that form a minority government have to keep each other happy, the successful stakeholders will understand what it will take to navigate that, and recognize that they're going to have to be flexible. And this is something I think it's really important to, and I appreciate your indulging my stream of consciousness here. But it's important to understand that you can be committed to an objective and you can work to fulfill that objective, but demonstrating flexibility in how you're going to get there does not necessarily mean that you're equivocating on your commitment. The objective is the objective. You have to be realistic on what it's going to take to achieve that objective. And it may be, depending on the environment that you're working with, it may be that your objective has to be achieved in stages over a longer period of time, rather than just as a up-down vote on a particular subject.
Exactly. And as most folks should know, certainly from experience, I mean, I can recall federal government, certainly in minorities back in the 70s, the lifespan of a minority government is a lot shorter than it is for a majority. And not only is it that different animal by virtue of being a minority, but you're looking at a life cycle that everybody knows is more likely 2 years or sometimes less than it is the standard 4. And again, that needs to factor into the approach that one takes. So, well, with that, I'm going to start kind of wrap up. David, you got one last point you want to make?
Just really quickly. I think this is the thing. I mean, when we're dealing with governments and particularly with minorities, I mean, good advocacy is an iterative process. You may think is this record skipping? I mean, am I going to have to say this, sing this song one more time? Yeah, yes. You do sometimes. So, I mean, you have to be committed, you have to be consistent, stay committed to your objective and just get her done.
Absolutely. Super. Yep. Well, like I said, I think we'll take this opportunity to wrap things up. I didn't see anything else coming up in the chat. Clearly someone sent you some private chats because it didn't come up in the main flow. Thanks, Wilma. But anyway, it was good to have that. So just a few key takeaways then for folks. Again, advocacy on behalf of a sector or an industry, it's a process. It's a long game issue. It's not something that you can just sort of tick off a box, said, yeah, we had a conversation with the government, now we're going to go and do something else. It really needs to have that level of commitment. And because of that, you really have to provide a level of planning and have to do your research into the who and the how of the government ministries and the individuals that are at that both operational and strategic level, both politically speaking and in terms of execution of the business of the ministry. You need to make sure you are familiar with how those decisions get made and by whom and the timeframes. And perhaps the overarching message overall is that advocacy is this relationship building exercise. And indeed, just as David said at the end there, when you have changes of government, you have changes of cabinet because of shuffles, there's all sorts of reasons things change even in the course of a given government, that yeah, you're going to have to be repeating your message, different people time and time again, but that is the nature of the business of advocacy. And if that sort of drives you around the bend, then this might not be the best place for you to be spending your time. You need to be able to re-articulate the same thing you told the previous minister or the same thing you told the previous government, and ensure that, of course, your argument is solidly backed up. So that's really what that's all about. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up. And thank you very much for putting up our thank you slide. Thank you very much, David. Absolutely brilliant insights into your machinations and mind there for this. You've got such a unique and deep experience in these areas. I'm really glad we've had this opportunity to share your perspectives this way. Want to give a shout out to all the partners for National Engineering Month, including Humber College as the leader sponsor, and as you can see, the other levels of sponsorship, including, of course, ACEC Ontario itself. We will be having some additional events and things, some of which will be exclusive to our member firms, but some which will be otherwise generally available, that deal with the election as time goes forward. And with that, I will wish everybody a good day. Thank you very much for participating in this session for National Engineering Month 2022, and take care of yourselves. Bye.
Thanks very much.